Okay, so I was just looking up the Gemara uh, based based on what we're about to learn. So let me just let me just show you the Gemara one for 1 second, because the Gemara is describing. Uh, okay, this is a Gemara from Bava Kama Daf. Here, let me just make sure I'm sharing the screen. Hold on. Here we go. It's a Gemara in Bava Kama. Gufa Amar Shmuel. Dina de Malchusa Dina. So Shmuel was taught that the law of the land is the law. Amar Rava, Teda, de Kotli Dikli, the Gashri Gishri, the Avrinan Alayu. Know that this principle is true from the fact that the municipal authorities cut down palm trees without the consent of their owners and construct bridges from them, and yet we allow ourselves to cross over them. And so, like he says in the translation, evidently the wood is not considered stolen property, which one is prohibited from using. Because, normally, if you know the property is stolen, you're not allowed to benefit from it. The fact that we allow ourselves to cross these bridges means that even though the government used the principles of eminent domain to confiscate property from their owners, we see that the law of the land is the law. And if the government confiscates property so that they can build a bridge, it's not considered stolen property. So Amar le Abaye, B'dilma mishum di'iyaush lehu minayhu marayhu. But maybe the reason why we're permitted is not because the government is allowed to confiscate property, because the law of the land is the law, but rather it's because the government is considered to be a gazlan. But since the owners had yeush, we know that once you convert something and you take it out of the hands of a gazlan, and the government has given this bridge to the public, maybe that's the reason why we're allowed to use it, because even though it's stolen, it's no longer in the hands of the gazlan. Amar lei ilo dina de malchusa dina heicha miyashi. So Rava said back to Abaye, if not for the fact that the law of the kingdom is the law, how would the despair of the owners of the trees allow us to use the bridge? The fact that the owners have despaired of retrieving their wood does not affect a transfer of property, and therefore still belongs to the government. If the government is a gazlan, we would still not be allowed to benefit from that wood, assuming that the planks have not been transformed in any significant way. So the Gemara's argument is there's been no shinoi rishos, there's been no change of ownership. It still is in government hands, and if the government is a gazlan, we wouldn't be allowed to benefit from it. So the Gemara then asks another interesting question. V'halo ka'avdi kida amar malka. Malka amar zilu v'kitlu mikol bagi, v'inhu azlu v'katlu michad baga. The Gemara then questions Rava. But the municipal authorities, in other words, these proxies of the king, who allegedly fulfill the wishes of the king, are really not fulfilling the king's wishes and are taking liberties on their own. Because the king said, go and cut down a bit of wood from all the valleys in the area, so that each individual loses only a small amount of wood. They, however, disobey the king and go and cut down all the wood needed for the bridge from one valley. Therefore, even if the law of the kingdom is the law, this cannot be the reason that the halacha permits Jews to cross over such bridges, as the authorities are not enforcing the law of the kingdom, but rather their own unlawful inclinations. Right, so this is the question of the Gemara. The king appoints builders, and he tells them, go ahead and chop down wood from the entire area so that the citizens of the area are contributing towards the construction of the bridge. The king's intention is that they should take a little bit of wood from each subject. But the builders are lazy, and they're not interested. They don't care where the wood comes from. So as long as they find one little place where there's a lush amount of wood, they're going to cut the wood down from there. And if that's the case, they're disobeying the edict of the king, and maybe this therefore is stolen property because they're not following the instructions of the king. Right? Everyone understand the question? So the Gemara's answer is Shlucha de Malka Kemalka Velo Torach the inhu afsid anafshaihu di boilu the inkot mikule bagi mishkal demei. So the Gemara answer is basically this. The proxy of the king has the same status of the king. A guy's a tax collector from the CRA or the IRS, and he says, I want your this item. You have to relinquish it. He's not acting as a gazlan. He's acting at the wishes of the behest of the king. But he's lazy. And human nature is that people are lazy. He's an employee of the king. King's going to pay him a salary, whether he spends time gathering wood from all of the citizens of the valley, or if he just goes to one place in the valley and takes all the wood from there. It's much more convenient and easy and less time consuming for him to take it all from one area. Now, so therefore he is considered to be fulfilling the proxyship of the king, and the inhu afsid anafshayu, and it is the citizens of the area who are causing themselves to lose out. Why? So look at the interpretation. They, the owners of the land where the wood is cut, cause themselves a loss, as they should collect compensation from all the other residents of the valleys and take money from them for this purpose. Since the landowners whose wood was used have permission to collect compensation from all the residents in the area, the authorities are acting within their rights by confiscating wood from a single location. In other words, part of the convention of living in this country is that in the event that one person is forced to, because of the rules of eminent domain, has to lose his property, the built into the government constitution is that the other residents of the area should put up a collection and make that one person whole. And that's basically the Gemara is sort of stating that that's the implicit law of the land, that if one person has a highway built on his property, or if one person has all the wood confiscated from his property, so then the other residents of that neighborhood have to relinquish some of their goods or property in order to make that one neighbor whole. And in that sense, there will be equity. There will be a redistribution proportionate to everyone gives up a proportionate amount of their property for this bridge or this highway that's being built. And therefore, there's no untoward or illegal activity that's taking place by the person who's the bridge builder on behalf of the government. Okay? So that's the principle that we're working with. I'm not sure if there's any kind of similar institution in modern political theory, but that's sort of like the system that the Gemara is working with, and it forms the basis of the halacha that we're going to see now in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Okay,
Rabbi, years
Yes,
ago in Toronto, there was a situation when they built the Allen Expressway.
Yeah.
So what happened? There were a number of homes that were expropriated by the government, and a lot of people were very upset about it too. So how would this play out here, where these people are getting maybe what the government perceives as value for their house, but maybe less than they would like, and their neighbors around them, should they be helping out or being involved in any sort of way, who just sort of missed the cut and they didn't get their houses expropriated?
Well, the Gemara seems to be describing a convention that I'm not aware that exists anymore in places like the US or Canada. In other words, what the Gemara is describing is that if the government ends up confiscating property, the government will not pay the person from whom they've confiscated the property from them, but rather will expect the other members of that community to give up some of their property in order to make that neighbor whole. Or maybe the government will supervise that process. Today, it works differently. Today, if the government has to confiscate my property or if they have to build a highway on my property, they will pay me fair market value for it. And those are the rules of eminent domain. I have to say that, by the way, is that extension going through the Allen Expressway extension? Because the truth is, the residents of that very ritzy neighborhood, Forest Hill neighborhood, of wherever they were supposed to build the Allen Expressway, there must have been a lot of greasing of palms, because in most cities they just would have, that are so congested like Toronto is, they would have just built over it and they would have figured out a way to pay people for it. But this is, I mean, it's very unusual. You'd have to admit that
There were a
this,
lot of, oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Izzy.
There were a lot of protests and petitions, and I mean, it stopped at Eglinton because of all
Yeah.
the petitions and the protests.
Yeah, I mean, it's all before my time, but I have to say that it seems from an outsider like myself, the whole thing just seems quite bizarre, that the city can't expand. Every city that goes through this kind of explosive growth like Toronto has to be able to expand its roadways to be able to accommodate the huge increase in traffic. For whatever reason, they couldn't get through, they couldn't finish the Allen Expressway, and people are suffering for it to this day. And when I say suffering, I don't mean, oh, people are being inconvenienced. I mean, there are this accumulates into the billions of dollars of lost income for people who have to sit on the road and not be able to do their work properly. So, I mean, there's huge economic impact if a government can't be able to have the power of eminent domain. So, all right. All right, so let's take a look at the halacha now. Okay, so here the illustration is ucheshekana o Yisrael, that if, let's say, a Jew, and we explained it means a Jew or a non-Jew, but you happen the illustration is a Jew because you know that the Jew is assumed to be doing things honestly. When he purchases the rights of tax collection for the king, okay, so he goes ahead, negotiates with the king, and basically says, King, you've got 1,000 residents in this village. You are expecting X amount of money from this level of population. I will pay you that amount, and I will go ahead and collect that amount, or plus a little bit of, a cost for my expenses of collection, and I will collect the head tax from each and every person. But don't worry, King, I'll go ahead and as long as you get your 100 rubles a year from each person, I'll just collect 110 rubles just to cover my costs. And that's the deal that's made. And the guy goes ahead and he starts collecting taxes. Afilu noda shelokeach yoser mikitzvas hamelech. Let's say he goes ahead and instead of doing what he had arranged with the king to collect $110 or rubles from each resident, he goes ahead and collects 150. So he lines his pockets by collecting more than he was authorized to collect by the government. Okay, and this was a regular practice, and it was such a regular practice that it's documented in all of these ancient halachic works. Okay, Vaharehu Gazlan, and so therefore he is a Gazlan. He's taking from people more than the government had authorized him to take. Nonetheless, Asr lahavriach mimenu mashemagia lo al pi kitzvasana. The only thing is that you have to make sure that you at least give him. Now, we know that tax evasion is usr, but tax evasion from a gazlan is mutter, right? But the added twist over here is I'm allowed to get out of paying what the gazlan wants me to pay, but I can't get out of paying to the gazlan what the king has authorized him to collect. So if the king has authorized him to collect $110 from each person and he goes ahead and collects 150, I'm only allowed to evade paying that much tax that he is illegally collecting from each citizen. Okay, Ela Hamosar. So I'm only allowed to evade paying the $40 in that example that I gave, but I cannot evade paying the entire amount. Kagon. Now, again, I'm not aware of any real life situation where this would potentially come up, but I suppose, like if I'm part of a homeowners association, right? And I know that the homeowners association has authorized Yankel, the property manager, to collect X amount of money from each person, and he does a big shakedown and is expecting people to give more, that's potentially a microcosm of what we're talking about, right? But it's basically the idea of a guy is trying to line his pockets by getting more than what he's legitimately entitled to get. So I'm allowed to evade giving a Goslin stolen goods, but I'm not allowed to evade giving a Goslin what the government has told him that he rightfully collects. Kagon. Im notel shlish yoser al kitzvas hamelech, lo yavriach mimenu el shlish haschoira. So he says, if the person is taking a third more than what the king had authorized them to collect, you're only allowed to tell him that you have a third less merchandise that he would normally be taxing. So you're allowed to actually, and as the Imrei Yaakov writes over here, he says, Asur lahavriach mimenu, you're not allowed to evade paying taxes, dahavi kegozel min hagazlan da'asur. You're not allowed to steal from a Goslin just because the guy's a Goslin. But if he's legitimately collecting on behalf of the government, that doesn't give you a right to steal from him. Amri inchi basar genova genova time. Like the Gemara says that there's a saying that hagonev min haganav, that if you steal from a ganav, afhu toim tam geneva, then you're also participating in an illicit act of theft. So lo yavrich mimenu ela shlish. He says you're only allowed to evade paying a third. And this is true even if you'll have to lie in your tax return. In other words, so for example, a guy comes and you're a lumber, you have a lumber yard, and the guy says, okay, show me the receipts from your lumber yard because I'm collecting, the HST from your lumber yard, okay? And so you basically cook the books so that the guy will only see that you've sold 2/3 of what you've actually sold. And the reason why it's permitted to do that is because the guy is taking, instead of taking 13% HST, he's taking 18% HST or whatever it is. But so that you're allowed to do. But you're only allowed to cook the books because the guy himself who's collecting the tax is a Goslin. And then he writes in Imrei Yaakov, let's say there aren't two options. Like, let's say there isn't an option to evade paying a third. You can either pay him the full amount or you can pay him nothing. So va'azlo yakabel hamoches afilu chelko shemagia lo mikol makom shari the hamoche shehu gazlan hu da'afsida nafshe. He says then it would still be permitted for you to lie and to be able to basically say that I have no merchandise, I have had no sales. Ela de mikol makom yira sheyavlia lo becheshbon b'makom acher ba'ofen sheyagia lidei hameches hachelek hamagia lefi hadin. But in that case, since you haven't paid your fair share of taxes, you have to figure out a way to get the government what its due is. In other words, if this tax collector is corrupt and you don't have the opportunity to give him only what he's entitled to, but rather you can either, because of whatever logistics, you can either give him the full amount or you basically say, I don't have a business. So then you can do that. You can lie, provided that you make sure that the government gets its due in some other way. You have to basically circumvent this fellow. Okay? So basically that's the halacha. when you're dealing with a corrupt tax collector. So, ligzol min hagazlan, because you're not allowed to steal what a gazlan is rightfully collecting. And since the guy, part of what he's collecting is really the tax that the king has authorized him to collect, then you're committing a complete act of theft by not paying him at least what he was authorized to collect. Now, that's all when the person who is the tax collector has basically paid already the king, and the king has now authorized him to collect a certain head tax. Basically, in this scenario, and this is an important distinction because you're going to see the other case in just a moment. In this particular case, the money that the tax collector is collecting is not going to the king, but he's getting to keep it. Why? Because the tax collector has already paid the king what he is due. And so the king basically sends him off. He says, you're off to your own devices, but I'm only authorizing you to collect 110 from each person. Because since you paid me $100 per person already for these 1,000 citizens, I'm totally okay. I've gotten my $100,000 for what I was expecting to get from these subjects, and therefore you go ahead now and collect your own tax, okay, and recoup whatever you've expended to me. Avol. So the contrasting case is as follows. Avol im lo kina'o min hamelech. But let's say the tax collector is not someone who paid the king already what is due the government. Ela shehu memuna lamelech. But rather he's a proxy of the king. This is more like the case that we saw in the Gemara. He's the king's proxy, and basically the king has basically hired a royal tax collector and said, you're in charge of making sure that everyone pays $100 head tax. V'noda shemosif al kitzvaso la'atzma. And then it's discovered that this guy is collecting $120 head tax from everyone, and he's pocketing 20 and delivering 100 to the king. V'chein memuna moches nochri shestamohu mosif la'atzmo. And similarly, if you have a non-Jewish tax collector, where there's an assumption that the guy is lining his pockets. Up until now, we've been talking about a Jewish tax collector, where unless you know that he's corrupt, you have to just assume that he's doing the right thing. But if you have a non-Jewish tax collector, there's a fair assumption, right, in the times when this is written, that the guy is going to be trying to line his pockets. That was the common practice. So in that situation, mutter lahafriach mimenu kol hameches shekulo gez. So in that scenario, you're allowed to evade paying all of the amount, even if the king is legitimately allowed to collect $100. But if you know that the king's representative is corrupt, then you're allowed to evade paying entirely. And why is that? Shaharei hameches eno chov klal elamachmas din hamalchus. He says, because the whole tax, the legitimate right of the government to confiscate my property in the form of taxation is because we have to follow dina de malchus dina. It's because the law of the land is the law. B'keven shemeches zeh nigva lemelech shelo b'din hamalchus. And since this fellow is a king's representative, and he is collecting it in direct contravention of the edict of the king, because he's collecting more than what the king had authorized him. So he's completely subverting his job. He's acting as the king's representative, but is not doing what the king told him to do. Shaharei notel yoser mikitzvos hamalchus, because he's taking more than what the king told him to take. Harei kol geviyazu gezel gamur. So the argument, the logic is like this: everything that he's collecting is not by edict of the king. Because he's acting as the king's proxy and is not fulfilling is not acting upon the actual proxyship of the king. Because the king's proxy has the same powers as the king. But that's only v'hamelech shenoto shelo kedin hamalchus. And if a king is illegally collecting, and is going beyond his rights that are endowed to him by the government, Kagon Shehemid Mechas She'ein Lo Kitzva. For example, even if the king himself were to establish an unfair taxation, which doesn't have any fixed limit, but indiscriminately taxes the people. So even if the king does that himself, that's illegal. Because you're only allowed to, the reason why Dina de Malchusa Dina, that the law of the land is the law, is because the king is awarded special rights by consensus of the citizenry. But once the citizenry actually acknowledge that the taxation is onerous and oppressive, so then the king is no longer protected under the principle of Dina de Malchusa Dina. And if this guy is the king's proxy, so then it's as if the king is imposing onerous taxation. And therefore, Hareza Gezel, Kamosha Kasati, Lamal, as we've explained before. Va'av zeh shenotel yoser mikitzva samalchus, Hareza kemecha shein lo kitzva. And therefore, if the sheriff of Nottingham comes along, even if he's appointed directly by the king, but he's excessively, he's placing onerous taxation more than what the government normally would have a right to do, or or more than what the king has authorized to do. So then that's onerous taxation, and it's like a corrupt government. Then he's a government official who is taxing in a corrupt fashion, and therefore he's a goslin, and therefore you're allowed to evade paying all of the taxes to him. And so that's the distinction. He says, Masha'en ken Yisrael shekana hameches v'govei la'atzmo ve'enu shliach hamelech klal. He says that's the difference between this case and the first case. The first case was where you had a Jew or an honest non-Jew who actually purchased the rights of taxation from the government. So he's no longer a government representative, the tax collector in the first case, but rather is recouping what he expended to the government. And the government just granted him rights of collection, but as a private citizen, not as a government representative. So therefore, ein hosafaso shehumosef ligzol magras chelek hamelech klal. But so therefore, the only thing that he's stealing is the added amount. But since he's not acting at the behest of the government at all, but he's a private citizen, you still have to pay him what he has to pay to the government. Okay, Elachelek hamelech magila melech, the hamelech machar l'Yisrael zeh, ve'ein chelek hamelech nigra machmas Yisrael zeh shego b'yoser mechelto shekatzav lo hamelech. So he says, and the king's portion should in no way be detracted from or in any way lost just because this guy is going beyond what the king had authorized him to collect. Because the king is not collecting the taxes now, nor is his proxy, but rather it's a non-government entity that the king has sold rights of collection from, and therefore it's a totally different principle. I guess it's almost like comparable to when the government gives a contract to a private party to build something or to do something. A lot of times these private contractors may be acting in a corrupt fashion, but that's not traceable back to the government. Whereas if the contractor is a government employee, then it's traceable back to the government if any corruption occurs. And that's and basically in political theory, I guess, that kind of distinction exists in this situation of taxation as well. Because the king basically has extricated himself once he contracted with this private citizen, who now is in charge of making sure that the king's amount is collected, and he's trying to line his pockets in addition to that. Because there was a clean business deal that was made previously between this private citizen tax collector and the king. And now this private citizen has become a legitimate owner of rights of collection from the citizens. And it's no different from any kind of creditor who is trying to collect more than what is owed to him, She'ein rishayim ligzol mimenu chov shechayavim lo. So if I owe this guy the money, but he's trying to get more from me, I'm not allowed to evade paying him what I owe him. I'm just allowed to evade paying more than what I owe. So in this situation as well, when it's a private party, a person who's contracted with the government, you have to pay him at least what is owed to the government. But when he's acting as a government employee and he's trying to get more than what the government has authorized, so then you don't have to pay him anything at all, because he's basically acting as the government in a corrupt fashion, and you're not obligated to pay taxes at all to a corrupt government. Okay, that's the distinction. All right, so there's no questions. We'll hold it here for today, and Imrei Hashem will continue. All right, questions, comments?